In the early morning hours of February 10th, 1945, at precisely 6:30, Captain Edwin Hunt positioned himself on the western bank of the Maas River near Gennep in the Netherlands. He stood watching German artillery bombard the far shore, where British engineers were meant to construct a bridge within the next 48 hours. Hunt was 24 years old, and it had been 8 months since the invasion at Normandy. In all that time, he had never overseen the construction of a single bridge under enemy fire across flooded waterways. The situation had grown more desperate overnight. German forces had detonated the Schwammenauel Dam the previous evening. The resulting release sent 81,000 acre-feet of water cascading down the Ruhr Valley into the Maas at a velocity that threatened to transform a normally 300-meter-wide river into a 1,200-meter inland sea within a span of just 72 hours. Hunt's experience with water operations ran deep. He had commanded 15 Rhino ferries during the Gold Beach landings on June 6, 1944. Those shallow-draft vessels had successfully transported 93,000 vehicles ashore over the following 4 months, along with tanks, artillery pieces, half-tracks, and 440,000 tons of military supplies. The Admiral had reassigned him to England in September of that year, offering him a promotion and fresh orders. He was to report to 2nd Army headquarters. The chief engineer needed someone with expertise in watercraft and river operations. During December, Hunt was introduced to Lieutenant Constant Lambrechtsen van Ritham, a Dutch hydraulics professional aged 38, who had spent 2 decades with Rijkswaterstaat, the Netherlands' official water authority. Lambrechtsen had devoted his career to studying the Maas, the Rhine, and every tributary and floodplain between the German border and the North Sea. His understanding of water movement mirrored Hunt's comprehension of boats and vessels. Operation Veritable commenced 2 days prior, on February 8th. The offensive involved 50,000 troops and 500 tanks, representing the most significant British and Canadian operation since Normandy itself. The strategic objective appeared straightforward: advance southeastward from Nijmegen through the Reichwald forest, eliminate German forces occupying the terrain separating the Maas from the Rhine, then proceed across the Rhine to capture the Ruhr, Germany's industrial core. However, accomplishing this plan hinged upon constructing bridges, numerous bridges, and the Germans fully anticipated this necessity. Throughout January, Hunt had monitored intelligence dispatches indicating German engineers preparing explosive charges at every dam located upstream. 5 dams in total controlled the Ruhr River's headwaters, which flowed into the Maas downstream, the Schwammenauel, the Erft Talsperre, and 3 others. American troops advancing through the Hurtgen forest attempted to seize these dams before demolition, but they were unsuccessful. On February 9th, the 78th Infantry Division finally captured the Schwammenauel Dam, yet German combat engineers had already opened the discharge valves and wedged the gates apart before retreating. The reservoir now emptied at maximum capacity. An 18-foot water surge crashed through the Ruhr Valley. Within hours, it would reach the Maas. British 30th Corps required a crossing at Gennep. The 51st Highland Division had recently freed the town, following 36 hours of street-by-street combat. Over 1,200 structures stood in the town, most now reduced to rubble. As German forces withdrew, they destroyed the primary bridge. The railway bridge suffered the same fate. Both structures lay twisted and broken in the rushing current. Brigadier Campbell, the chief engineer of 2nd Army, had visited Hunt and Lambrechtsen on January 30th. He had unfolded maps across a farmhouse table located south of Nijmegen. At Gennep, the Maas normally stretched 300 meters across. Lambrechtsen had thoroughly examined rainfall patterns, snowmelt projections, and upstream reservoir volumes. Using this information, he formulated flood predictions extending back to December, when Operation Veritable planning began. The Dutch engineer informed Campbell that by mid-February, the river would expand to approximately 1,200 meters, possibly wider. The surrounding floodplain would be submerged under 3 to 4 feet of water. Conventional Bailey Bridge components would prove inadequate. What they required was something capable of floating, something that could move vertically as water levels shifted, something spanning more than a kilometre of fast-moving current. Campbell studied the figures with evident concern. 1,200 metres, equivalent to 4,000 feet. Throughout military history, no floating Bailey Bridge had exceeded 600 metres in length. Not during this war. Not ever. Hunt gazed at the rising water. The Moss was already climbing. He observed the current intensifying, quickening its pace. Debris floated past tree limbs, fence sections, remnants of structures. A dead bovine turned in the turbulent brown water. Montgomery required this bridge urgently. Operation Veritable faced stalling. The 51st Highland occupied territory in Gennep across the river, yet they remained unable to advance without tanks and heavy guns. The Canadians encountered fierce resistance in the Reichswald and could not break through. German opposition proved stronger than military intelligence had estimated. Getting heavy machinery across the Moss represented the bottleneck blocking the entire operation. Hunt possessed 48 hours to construct the most extensive floating bridge ever attempted in warfare, under conditions of flooding and hostile artillery fire. In collaboration with a Dutch engineer he had known for merely 6 weeks, should he fail, 50,000 soldiers would find themselves isolated on the incorrect bank of a river about to transform into a vast lake. Hunt had reported to 2nd Army Headquarters in Den Bosch on October 2, 1944, just 3 days after Allied liberation. The Chief Engineer's office occupied the town hall, its walls covered with maps detailing the Moss, the Rhine, the Waal, and every waterway between the battle lines and Berlin. Brigadier Campbell outlined the strategic challenge. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was developing a winter campaign into German territory. The offensive would require negotiating multiple rivers. German troops would demolish every crossing. Allied engineers would need to rebuild them rapidly, under fire, in environments unlike anything in their training. Campbell sought someone comprehending not just bridge engineering, but water itself, currents, tides, flood dynamics. Someone capable of observing a river and determining whether a bridge structure would endure or collapse during its first hour of service. Hunt's service record landed on Campbell's desk in late September. Rhino Ferry Commander on Gold Beach. 93,000 vehicles delivered. 440,000 tons of supplies moved. No ferries lost to tidal action or current problems. The Navy had documented something unusual in his performance reports. Hunt had predicted tidal variations more precisely than existing nautical charts indicated. He had placed his ferries in currents that other commanders deliberately circumvented. He possessed an instinctive feel for water dynamics. Campbell assigned Hunt an office and distributed hydrogeological surveys, Dutch governmental water information, captured German engineering documents from France, and rainfall records spanning 2 decades. For 6 weeks, Hunt absorbed everything about the Moss before encountering Lambrechtsen. The Dutch engineer arrived at Hunt's office in early December without prior notification. He simply walked in one morning carrying a leather portfolio full of maps. British forces had discovered him in a displacement centre in Eindhoven. As a civil engineer for Reichske's Water, he brought 20 years of expertise in managing flood control for the Moss and Rhine systems. Lambrechtsen displayed handmade maps showing decades of measurements, water elevations corresponding to each season, snowmelt patterns, spring flooding, summer dry periods. He had surveyed the Moss in locations absent from British mapping documents, old river channels, overflow routes, areas of floodplain that would fill perhaps once per decade. Throughout December and January, these two professionals collaborated. Hunt contributed military specifications, bridge capacity limits, loading ratings, construction schedules. Lambrechtsen provided forecasts regarding river location, height, flow velocity, and bottom composition, whether pontoons would function or get dragged. By January's conclusion, they had chosen Gennep as the vital crossing position. The town occupied elevated terrain on the eastern bank. Urfeld on the western bank provided an established approach highway. The ancient ferry operation that had functioned at this location for centuries demonstrated a stable riverbed and sufficiently expansive floodplain that even catastrophic flooding would dissipate rather than concentrate into a plain, concentrated destructive flow. Nevertheless, Lambrechtsen cautioned regarding the dams. The Schwammenauel Dam held 81,000 acre-feet alone. Should the Germans breach it or even harm the output management systems, the resulting flood could elevate the Maas by 15 feet, or potentially more. Water would spread across the entire floodplain. A conventional fixed bridge would submerge. Pontoons moored to banks would snap loose. They required a floating solution, yet floating Bailey bridges had inherent limitations. The longest floating Bailey bridge constructed during this war was the crossing near Rie over the Rhine, measuring 555 meters with approaches included, completed in peaceful circumstances after combat shifted eastward. Gennep would demand 1,200 meters, conceivably 1,300, if flooding proved as severe as Lambrechtsen projected. This represented twice the span of any floating Bailey bridge ever constructed, while fighting continued on a rising river. Campbell heard their proposal on January 30th. He verified Lambrechtsen's calculations, rechecking the mathematics. Subsequently, he turned toward his subordinate, Colonel Otto Phibbs, and delivered instructions. Instruct the sappers at MOO to manufacture 80 floating Bailey sections. Continue construction until further notice. We shall require every meter they produce. The 51st Highland Division assaulted Gennep on February 11th. German troops contested every building, every street. The Scots battled through wreckage and booby traps for 36 continuous hours. When dawn arrived on February 12th, the Union Jack flew over what remained of the municipal building. Hunt occupied the West Bank on February 10th, 48 hours prior to the Highlanders completing the clearance of Gennep, 72 hours before his engineers could commence construction, and the water was ascending faster than Lambrechtsen had forecast. On February 5th, a Canadian Spitfire executed reconnaissance photography confirming Lambrechtsen's most pessimistic projections. Flight Lieutenant Lightbody of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit descended to 100 feet above the Maas floodplain. Forward-directed diagonal images captured every 2 seconds. The photographs reached 2nd Army headquarters 6 hours later. German defensive positions along the eastern bank were already waterlogged. The lock structure at Samiek, located 3 kilometers upstream, rested beneath 2 feet of water, and this preceded the Schwammenauel Dam destruction. Lambrechtsen scrutinized the photographs with a magnifying instrument. He highlighted features meaningless to intelligence analysts, but crucial to someone with hydraulic engineering expertise. The weir at Samiek had been scoured during November's floods. A bypass passage had developed around its structure. The weir gates had become ineffective. The Germans could not manipulate water levels regardless of their desires. This development brought both advantages and drawbacks. Positive because it meant flooding would follow predictable patterns. Negative because nothing would slow the water cascading downstream from the raw valley. Hunt filed a requisition for 140 trucks on February 8th. The 7th Army Troops engineers had manufactured Bailey bridge sections at a facility near Mou since early February. 80-foot floating sections, composed of 6 rows, each containing 30 pontoon modules connected together. Individual sections weighed 11 tons each. Each section required specialized moving apparatus. The vehicles arrived at the facility on February 9th, the identical day the Schwammenauel Dam fell, the identical day German combat engineers obliterated the discharge mechanisms. Workers loaded throughout the night, Bailey panels, pontoon platforms, deck material, connecting ramps, anchor apparatus, welding equipment, every component required for constructing a floating bridge that still lacked a finalized design since no one could predict the exact dimensions when construction would start. The convoy staged in the town square at Street Anthonis, positioned 4 kilometers from the Maas. 140 trucks loaded with bridge materials stood ready, awaiting authorization to proceed forward, waiting for the 51st Highland to liberate Gennep so engineers could start building. Hunt observed the Highland assault on February 11th. The 5th Battalion Black Watch, 7th Gordons, 1st Gordons, Scottish soldiers advancing through a town transformed into a defensive stronghold. The Germans had possessed 19 days to establish fortifications following their January withdrawal past the Maas. 19 days to string explosives, excavate trenches, position automatic weapons. The battle for Gennep persisted 36 hours, fighting within buildings, within rooms. The Scots sustained injuries from sniper fire, mortar rounds, mine explosions, and distant artillery. German 88mm cannons, stationed east of the river, launched shells into already burning buildings. Structural collapse buried streets with rubble. The Highlanders pushed through regardless. When daylight came on February 12th, the fighting concluded. German forces retreated past the nearest river, 2 kilometers east of Gennep. They demolished both crossing structures behind them. The primary road structure, the railway crossing. Both collapsed into the current. Metal and concrete twisted into barriers, rendering the moss impassable by standard techniques. Hunt entered Gennep 2 hours after German soldiers departed. 1,200 structures, perhaps 300 still standing. Everything else was destruction. Walls lacking roofs, roofs separated from walls. The town's centre had vanished. The riverside landing station, where Dutch operators had managed ferry operations across generations, was now a rubble heap. Yet the ferry landing zones remained functional. The roads descending to the ferry dock locations retained their integrity. Lambrechtsen had assessed correctly. This location would work. The landing zones would conserve nearly 1,000 meters of Bailey components. When the floodplain eventually dried, those roads would become immediately operational. The bridge would only need to span the river channel itself, not the temporary flooded zones. Except the flooded zones would not dry, perhaps not for weeks, conceivably not for months. Hunt observed the moss from the west bank and watched it climb. Water already spread 50 meters wider than usual. Brown, turbulent debris drifted past every handful of seconds. The current strengthened as additional water descended from the raw valley. He possessed 48 hours until Montgomery's staff would demand specifics. How much time the bridge would require, what weight it could support, when initial tanks might traverse. Questions Hunt could not yet answer, because the river continued changing, rising, spreading across the floodplain Lambrechtsen had projected, would measure 1,200 meters across. The 7th Army Troops engineers were prepared. 140 trucks held bridge sections. Crews practiced in Bailey construction, welders, riggers, aquatic operators skilled at locating pontoon platforms in flowing currents. Everything stood prepared except the river itself. Work commenced at 7 on February 12th. The moss had risen another meter during the nighttime hours. Lambrechtsen took measurements at dawn. The floodplain stretched 1,100 meters from the western approach highway to the eastern bank and continued climbing. Hunt positioned his command post in a partially remaining warehouse. The structure lacked a roof, though 3 walls remained standing, providing adequate protection to display maps and safeguard radio apparatus from precipitation beginning at 4. The rain was frigid. February in the Netherlands. Mud everywhere. The 7th Army Troops engineers progressed from Street Anthonis before sunrise. 140 vehicles moving through darkness. They positioned themselves along the approach highway. Personnel commenced unloading bridge parts immediately. Each 80-foot segment required half a dozen workers to position, 11 tons of steel frameworks sitting on pontoon containers. Sections required assembly on dry land, then floating into position. The strategy involved simultaneous construction from both banks, 2 engineer groups, one advancing east from Urfeld, one advancing west from Gennep, meeting in the middle. Traditional Bailey Bridge methodology, except conventional parameters did not apply to this bridge. A Class 40 Bailey pontoon structure consisted of manufactured steel components positioned upon floating pontoon apparatus. Each pontoon functioned as a sealed metal container, 4 feet wide, 7 feet extended, 30 inches deep. The containers were fastened in groups, forming floating bases. The bridge surface sat atop these bases. The complete apparatus could bend with wave motion and adjust to shifting water heights. However, the system possessed constraints. The pontoons required securing not to the riverbed, which proved too profound and the current too powerful, but to the banks. Substantial cables extended from every pontoon base to anchoring positions driven into the ground along both shores. The cables permitted the bridge to move up and down with water levels while preventing downstream drift. At 1,100 meters, The bridge would require over 100 separate pontoon bases, over 400 separate pontoon containers, more than 800 anchor cables, and each cable required exact tension adjustment. Too slack and the bridge would sag or move laterally. Too rigid and the cables would fracture when water levels shifted. Lambrechtsen had worked out the cable tensions. He had included current strength, water profundity, atmospheric pressure effects, and vehicle mass traversing the bridge. His computations filled 16 sheets of handwritten calculations. Hunt had observed him verify the arithmetic 3 separate times. The Dutch engineer had staked his professional standing on precise numbers. The initial pontoon base entered the water at 9:30 on the Urveld side. 6 combat engineers guided it into position, utilizing poles and cables. The flowing current captured it immediately. The base swung downriver. The anchoring crew drove stakes into muddy ground and ran cables. Securing one base consumed 40 minutes. Hunt performed the calculation. 100 bases, 40 minutes per unit, 4,000 minutes total, 66 hours. Approaching 3 days merely to position the pontoons, presuming everything proceeded without complications. No hostile fire, no mechanical problems, no incidents. German artillery commenced at 10. 88mm cannons fired from positions east of the nearest river. Shells whistled overhead and burst along the west bank. Metal fragments spread across the approach highway. One truck absorbed a direct impact. Bailey sections scattered through the mud. 3 combat engineers sustained injuries too severe for continued duty. The engineers maintained their work. They possessed no alternative. Montgomery's whole operation depended upon this construction. Operation Veritable experienced stalling in the Reichwald. The 51st Highland occupied Gennep across the river without heavy equipment and limited ammunition. The Canadians incurred casualties attempting progress through waterlogged land without armour. 30th Corps required tanks across the Maas. Now, by the day's conclusion on February 12th, engineers had positioned 8 pontoon bases on the Urveld side, 6 on the Gennep side, 14 bases total, approximately 110 metres of bridge, 1/10 of total requirements. The rain intensified after sunset. The temperature dropped. The Maas persisted in rising. Lambrechtsen took water measurements every 2 hours. At midnight, the floodplain measured 1,180 metres across. Hunt computed they would require 148 pontoon bases, 50 additional units beyond initial calculations, and the Germans had adjusted their aim. February 13th. Engineers worked through darkness. Generators powered searchlights illuminating work zones on both banks. The lights provided perfect targeting for German gunners. Shells fell every 15 minutes, sometimes with closer intervals. Sappers learned to recognize the audio signature. The sound of approaching rounds, the sharp report of detonation, the high-pitched whistle of shrapnel fragments moving through air. 21 bases in the water when morning arrived. 30% completion, yet the rate was reducing. Manipulating pontoon containers became progressively more demanding as bases extended further into flowing water. The river moved at nearly 6 knots, sufficient to tear a base loose if anchor cables were not fastened instantaneously. One base broke free at 3. 6 sappers had been managing it into position when an anchor cable separated. The base rotated sideways into the flow. The workers jumped to safety. The base tumbled downstream, spinning end over end. Pontoon containers broke apart. 11 tons of steel and material vanished into the darkness. 200 meters of bridge components gone in mere seconds. Hunt submitted a request for replacement pontoons from the MOO facility, but supplies there were diminishing. All of Second Army was constructing bridges. The Rhine crossing remained weeks distant, yet preparations had started. Every available floating Bailey section in the Allied supply was assigned. Hunt's bridge received whatever materials remained, nothing more. Lambrechtsen devoted February 13th to revising calculations. The river had reached its maximum at 1,190 metres, surpassing his projections, though the pace of water rise was moderating. The Schwammenauel reservoir had nearly emptied. The flood wave had passed. The Maas would persist at this elevation for several days, then start a gradual decrease as upstream flow reduced. That represented good developments. The unfavorable part involved atmospheric conditions. Weather predictions anticipated powerful winds from the northwest, starting February 15th. Winds across a kilometer of exposed water would create wave formations. Waves would pressure the pontoon bases. Waves would render positioning the last sections in the river's center, where current was most powerful, nearly impossible. The engineers possessed a time frame, 48 hours, conceivably 60. They would need to finish before atmospheric conditions deteriorated. Afterward, construction would turn excessively hazardous. Bases could separate, cables could break, personnel could drown in water frigid enough to cause death within minutes. Hunt pushed the crews forward with greater intensity. 12-hour rotations transformed into 18-hour rotations. Combat engineers persisted until exhaustion nearly overcame them. Then they continued. Prepared meals arrived from cooking operations every 6 hours. Hot, liquid, stew, baked goods. Personnel consumed standing, consumed during movement, consumed while striking anchor stakes into frozen ground. German artillery intensified on February 14th. The cannons had concentrated on the bridge itself. Currently, they concentrated on the causeways. Shells descended among work parties. Detonations hurled mud and stone into the air. Gaps formed in newly laid roads. Teams filled the gaps, dispersed additional stone, continued forward. 4 sappers sustained injuries. On February 14th, a direct strike hit a team positioning a base near the Gennep bank. The explosion threw 2 workers into the river. The current carried them before assistance could arrive. 2 additional personnel perished instantly from projectile wounds. The team secured the base, advanced to the subsequent one. When evening fell on February 14th, 61 bases floated in the water. Approximately half the bridge was finished. Yet the engineers showed signs of severe exhaustion. Injuries increased: frostbite, trench foot, cuts and bruises from managing steel panels throughout darkness. 3 workers required evacuation due to broken limbs, falls from bases, crushed extremities, standard incidents occurring when personnel extended beyond fatigue limits. Then the floodplain commenced draining. Lambrechtsen observed it initially. Water height was reducing. Minimal, just 2 centimeters, yet reducing. The flood wave had transferred completely. The river was going back to normal current velocities, which meant pontoon bases positioned in 3 feet of water yesterday now sat in 2 feet of water. The cables had excessive tension. The bases could not adjust. Teams had to go back and readjust every cable. Every base, 61 bases, 8 cables per base, 488 cables total. The work that should have progressed forward was now moving backward. Hunt calculated the resulting delay. 6 hours minimum, conceivably 8. 6 hours they could not waste. And the atmospheric disturbance was approaching. Engineers worked throughout February 15th, readjusting cables. Every base required modification as water height dropped. The work demanded technical precision. A cable insufficiently tight would permit the base to move. Excessively tight and it would fracture when vehicles crossed and the bridge bent under load. Lambrechtsen moved from base to base with a measuring device and writing pad. He examined cable positioning, recorded water profundity, computed revised tension figures. His hands were cut and painful from the cold. His uniform was drenched from river spray. He had not slept during 36 continuous hours. Hunt established a communication network. Couriers transported Lambrechtsen's calculations from the river to team leaders on both banks. The leaders modified cable tensions based on the computations. No improvisation. No estimation. Every cable adjusted exactly to specification. It was slow, meticulous, and it was consuming time they did not possess. The wind reached 14 hours on February 15th. Northwest winds precisely as predicted, 20 kilometers per hour initially, increasing to 30 by evening. Waves formed on the exposed water. Half-meter undulations moving from the Urfeld side toward Gennep. The pontoon structures commenced moving, lifting and descending, flexing against the anchor cables. 3 cables fractured between 14 and 16. The bases did not separate, though they shifted. Crews required re-anchoring them. Additional delays. Additional squandered hours. German personnel with observation equipment spotted the activity. Artillery intensified. The Germans understood what the British were building. A bridge of this magnitude could indicate just one thing. Montgomery was arranging to move armor past the Moss. The Germans concentrated all accessible firepower on the construction site: 88mm cannons, 105mm mortars, grenade launchers. 7 sappers sustained injuries on February 15th, 2 killed. A grenade explosion struck a team near the river's center. The force knocked 4 workers from a base into the water. 2 received rescue immediately. 1 perished before help reached him. His remains were located 3 hours later, 200 meters downstream. Yet the bridge expanded. 78 bases. By evening on February 15th, 89 bases. When daylight arrived on February 16th, the two halves were getting nearer. The Urfeld side had extended 540 meters into the river. The Gennep side had reached 490 meters. 50 meters of open water persisted between them. This was the most risky section. The last bases required positioning in the deepest, most powerful section of the channel. Current velocity was most intense here, 7 knots, powerful enough to drag a person under almost instantly, powerful enough to move a pontoon base downstream if the anchoring team was not perfectly synchronized. Hunt selected his most experienced crews for this final phase. Combat engineers who had been working since February 12th. Personnel who could position a base in complete darkness, who could strike anchor stakes into frozen ground while partially submerged in flowing water, who could rejoin a separated cable while under bombardment. The opening narrowed on February 17th, base after base. The Urfeld team moved eastward. The Gennep team moved westward. 40 meters gap, 30 meters, 20 meters. Hostile gunfire persisted constantly. Shells burst in the water, on the bases, along both banks. The engineers disregarded it. They had an assignment. They would complete it. At 16:45 on February 17th, the final base was positioned. Combat engineers from both sides convened in the river's middle. They fastened the last Bailey components, tightened the connections, positioned the last deck sections. The bridge was finished. 1,190 meters, 3,900 feet, the most extended floating Bailey bridge constructed during World War II, yet it remained isolated. The floodplain on both sides remained beneath 2 feet of water. The approach roads finished at the river's edge. Tanks could not reach the bridge. Transportation could not cross. The engineers had constructed a bridge to nowhere. They possessed 72 hours to establish causeways across the flooded region. 72 hours before Montgomery's staff would demand results, and the Germans remained active. Causeway construction started immediately. The floodplain was drying, though insufficiently rapidly. 2 feet of sitting water submerged the land, separating the firm approach roads from the riverbanks where the bridge started. Transportation could not proceed through water that profound. They would get stuck in mud. Mechanical systems would fill with water. The complete crossing would develop into a traffic jam underneath hostile fire. Hunt's engineers constructed temporary pathways across the submerged areas. Crushed rock, smaller stones, Bailey bridge segments positioned horizontally, forming a solid base. The work proved physically punishing. Trucks distributed tons of fill resources into sitting water. Engineers distributed it manually. Shovels, rakes, boots sinking into mud with every movement. The causeway on the Urfeld side demanded 200 meters of fill. The Gennep side needed 170 meters. Each had to bear the mass of Churchill tanks, 40 tons per vehicle, the heaviest armor in the British force. Should a tank break through the causeway base, it would sink into the mud, obstruct the complete crossing, trap every vehicle behind it. Lambrechtsen worked out the load specifications. 6 inches of crushed stone minimally, 8 inches in sections where mud was most profound, compacted, sorted, drainage channels cut along both sides, channeling water away from the path. The work demanded precision under conditions making precision exceptionally problematic. German artillery adapted targets on February 18th. The cannons had been striking the bridge itself. Currently, they concentrated on the causeways. Shells descended among working teams. Detonations ejected mud and stone into the air. Voids appeared in the newly placed roads. Teams refilled the voids, dispersed more stone, continued forward. 6 sappers sustained injuries on February 18th, 1 killed. Metal fragments from a grenade explosion. Medical personnel evacuated casualties through the half-finished causeway. Stretchers transported through water reaching the ankles. The wounded were positioned into recovery vehicles that moved backward toward the medical center at Boxmeer. When evening concluded on February 18th, the causeways were 70% finished. However, the bridge remained untested. No transportation had crossed. No one could be certain if the pontoon bases would endure under tank mass. No one could be certain if the cables would snap, if the bridge would flex excessively and fracture, if the current would move the complete structure downriver. Hunt scheduled a test passage at 8 on February 19th. A solitary jeep, light cargo vehicle, 4 personnel. Should the jeep succeed, they would attempt heavier cargo carriers, larger trucks, cannons, ultimately tanks. First priority, the jeep. The vehicle accessed the bridge from the Urfeld side at 8:15. The operator progressed gradually, 10 kilometers per hour. The bridge surface bent under the mass. The pontoon bases descended and ascended with the motion. Cables created sounds. Steel elements groaned. The jeep persisted. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. German artillery resumed firing at 8:20. Shells descended around the bridge. Water explosions erupted on both sides. The jeep did not pause. The operator sustained steady pace, controlled, careful. The vehicle crossed the center line, kept advancing. The Gennep side was becoming visible. 300 meters remaining. 200 meters, 100 meters. The jeep departed the bridge onto the Gennep causeway at 8:32, 17 minutes to traverse 1,190 meters. The bridge had endured. The test was victorious. Hunt promptly sent heavier transportation forward. A 3-ton truck crossed at 9, then a 5-ton truck, then a universal transporter. Every additional vehicle pressured the bridge more substantially. Every passage confirmed the structure could sustain the load. By midday on February 19th, 20 transportation units had crossed. By the day's conclusion, over 100. The bridge was functional, though not yet open, not formally. Montgomery desired to view it initially. Churchill desired to witness it. The Prime Minister and the military commander were arriving in Gennep. They would examine the most extended Bailey Bridge constructed during the war. They would observe initial tanks crossing, and should the bridge catastrophically fail with Churchill observing it, the operation would turn into a catastrophe that no engineering victory could counterbalance. The officials were projected to arrive on February 21st. Hunt possessed 48 hours to guarantee the bridge would not fail, while 50 Churchill tanks crossed simultaneously, with the British Prime Minister viewing from the West Bank. February 20th, the concluding preparations. Hunt examined every pontoon base, every cable, every anchoring point. Lambrechtsen took new water measurements. The floodplain continued draining gradually. Water had descended an additional 10 centimeters overnight. Cables required modification once more. The teams worked throughout morning hours. The initial tanks crossed at 14. A formation of Churchill tanks, 4 units, each weighing 40 tons. The tanks entered the bridge single file with 30 meters separating each vehicle. Conventional crossing technique. The bridge surface sagged under the mass. The pontoon bases sank further into water, yet the structure remained intact. Additional tanks advanced. The 7th Armoured Division, the Guards Armoured Division. By evening on February 20th, over 200 transportation units had crossed the Moss at Gennep. Tanks, self-propelled firearms, ammunition trucks. The bridge handled every weight. The cables endured. The pontoons remained floating. Winston Churchill arrived at 11 on February 21st. Field Marshal Montgomery was with him. Additionally present were Field Marshal Alan Brooke, head of the Imperial General Staff, and Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, commanding British Second Army. The pinnacle of British military authority, positioned on the Moss's west bank, observing tanks traverse a bridge that had not existed 9 days previously. Hunt and Lambrechtsen stood beside the dignitaries. Neither individual had rested during 60 continuous hours. Each was coated in mud. Churchill exchanged brief comments with Hunt. He requested specifics regarding construction duration, requested casualty data. Hunt communicated 8 sappers killed, 23 wounded. The Prime Minister acknowledged, looked at the bridge stretching across the river, stated it represented magnificent engineering. Montgomery strolled partway through the bridge. He examined the pontoon bases, inspected the cable anchoring apparatus, observed a Churchill tank traverse within meters of his position. The complete structure bent under the mass, yet remained steady. Montgomery returned to the west bank. He informed Hunt the bridge had rescued Operation Veritable. The 7th Army Troops engineers had constructed 1,190 meters of floating Bailey Bridge during 8 days, while under fire, under flood circumstances, with a river that changed height every handful of hours. The preceding record for a floating Bailey Bridge was 555 meters. This bridge was more than double that span. The causeway work persisted through late February. Engineers extended and upgraded the approaches as the floodplain progressively dried. By March 1st, the bridge could sustain continuous transportation. Tanks traversed around the clock, trucks, cannons, ammunition columns, every item supporting Montgomery's advancement toward the Rhine. Operation Veritable concluded on March 11th. German forces had been pushed past the Rhine. The West Bank was controlled. Montgomery started preparations for the Rhine operation itself, Operation Plunder. The assault would start on March 23rd and would succeed primarily because Montgomery could concentrate his forces, because he could transfer armor swiftly, because bridges similar to the one at Gennep had kept his movement progressing. The Gennep Bridge persisted in service well following war's termination. A permanent structure was not finished until 1955. For a decade, the Bailey Bridge carried cargo across the Moss, transportation vehicles, reconstruction equipment, resources that restored the Netherlands. The bridge, constructed for conflict, became an instrument of reconstruction. Hunt earned promotion to major. He went back to England following VE Day, returned to maritime work, educated personnel in navigation and watermanship at Metropolitan and East London institutions until 1985. He received the position of Queen's Barge Master in 1978. He passed in July 2022 at age 102. Lambrechtsen went back to Reichkes Water following liberation, invested the subsequent 2 decades, reconstructing the Dutch water systems that conflict had demolished, the embankments, the gates, the flood management networks protecting the Netherlands from maritime forces. A monument was inaugurated at Gennep on May 11, 2022. Hunt attended, age 102. He positioned himself at the location where the bridge had been constructed 77 years before, where 8 personnel had perished constructing a bridge that contributed to finishing the conflict, where he and a Dutch engineer had handled an extremely challenging problem utilizing mathematics, steel, and resolve. Should this narrative impacted you similarly to how it impacted us, grant me a request. Activate that like button. Every single activation communicates to YouTube to distribute this narrative to additional audiences. Hit the subscription notification. We are rescuing overlooked accounts from forgotten records every single day. Accounts regarding engineers who rescued thousands using floating systems and hydraulic formulas. Actual individuals, genuine bravery. Post a message right now and communicate your viewing location. Are you watching from the North American country, the United Kingdom, Canadian territory, Australian continent? Our group stretches across the complete planet. You represent not simply an observer, you are participating in keeping these recollections alive. Communicate your position. Communicate whether a family member participated. Just communicate your attendance. Gratitude for your viewership, and gratitude for guaranteeing Hunt and Lambrechtsen do not fade from collective memory. These professionals merit recognition, and you are facilitating that reality.